If you had asked a Novation Circuit user a year ago what they wanted to see in a Novation Circuit 2, they probably would have said some combination of USB audio, especially multi-track audio over USB, another synth track, maybe a revamp of the synth engine, and chromatic flipping of samples. As it turns out, that already exists, and it's called the Roland MC-101. However, Novation did release the first of the Circuit 2s, the Novation Circuit Tracks, and today I'm going to do the long-awaited comparison between the two devices, and it is not as clear-cut as some people might think. These have different strengths and different weaknesses, and even different use cases, and I'm going to get into that hands-on on the devices. All right, let's get one thing out of the way first. Price. At the moment that I'm filming this in early 2021, you can probably get a used Roland MC-101 for about the same price as a new Novation Circuit Tracks. However, note that that is subject to change. For one thing, this normally retails around $500, and for another thing, the Circuit Tracks will probably come down in price in a similar way to the Roland MC-101 if you give it enough time. At the moment, I'm just going to operate under the assumption that the Tracks is less expensive than the 101, because if you're buying them new, that's basically the case. Also note, because my audio interface only has 2 inputs and I'm too lazy to set up something else, I've got a mono out of each device. That's going to be as far as we go for the sound quality shootout here. I'm going to include some proper audio examples at the end of this video. But let's jump into the devices themselves, because there's some key differences that I want to draw your attention to. First of all is the way they handle samples. So let me jump into the note setup for my MC-101 samples. On the MC-101, you have a dedicated track type for drums and for one-shot samples in general. So in this case, that is all living on this one track, and if you want to control individual sounds, you hit Shift Sound, and then you can select each pad and control a bunch of parameters like volume, effects, sends, EQs, lengths, all that kind of stuff. And if you want to modify the actual sample, like set its start and end point, or switch it out for one of the stock sounds, or for a sound on the SD card that you just drag and drop right in, you go Shift and hit the pad. So this also brings to light another difference that I do want to touch on real quick. There is a lot of shift and do something else on this device, and there's a good amount of like memorization that you have to do. I actually have a little note on my phone that has some of the most handy shortcuts that really speed up your workflow and are really nice to have, but some of it is not obvious, and a lot of it is a few button presses away from a shortcut, and there's some memorization there, so just bear that in mind. We're going to get more into workflows in a second. The Circuit Tracks, on the other hand, handle samples quite differently. For one thing, it cannot flip samples chromatically like this can. If I want to pitch a sample around chromatically, that's super easy. All I have to do is load it into a tone track, which is like their synth track, and that can either take stuff from their Zen Core synth engine or from samples on the SD card, and then you can just do this. And you can even build in glide and that kind of stuff. You cannot do that on the tracks. You're probably going to see something like that crop up in the Novation Circuit Rhythm. That's supposed to come later in 2021. But let's get back to the Circuit Tracks. This has stuff set up very differently. Rather than a dedicated drum track, and to be clear, you can have all 4 of these be drum tracks if you really wanted to. It has separate drum tracks, 1, 2, 3, 4 of them, all operating with independent patterns that can kind of just act alone or together if you want them to. And each drum track can only have one sample playing at a time. However, you can switch between samples on each drum track. So for example, let me mute all this stuff. And I've got drum 1 here. That is switching back and forth between the kick, which is up here, and the snare, which is down here. And I could either record that in live or program it in, same deal in here for that matter. And with the tracks, what's new from the original circuit is that you can actually program in the sample changes. So let's say I want to bring in this snare as well. I could just hold this step down, select this one, and boom, it's in there, which is super nice. And then I can just select that step to get rid of it, or I could long press the step to assign something else to it. So that's definitely a bit of a change up, and then you can send these to the effects very independently of each other, and you have stuff like distortion that you do not have on here. That's a bit much. You get the idea. And each drum track, once again, operates independently and can be processed independently. Another difference between the Circuit Tracks and this is that you can play with velocity. So if you hit a pad a little lighter, the sound will actually be a little quieter. There's a bit of expressiveness built into that. You cannot do that on the Roland MC-101, although you can program velocity into either, and you can also lock the velocity if you don't want that level of expressiveness and would rather something be very consistent, which is nice. That's something else that's new to the tracks, is that locking. Another important difference between these two devices is sidechaining. The Roland MC-101 has none, which is very sad, and I hope that someday they add it. I'm not sure how that would be possible, but I would love to see it in there. But regardless, we don't have it here. We do have it here, and you can even control which drum track triggers the sidechain, and then you can control how much sidechaining there is for each element. So here's just an example project. Versus on here. The kick and the snare are just kind of there. And that is definitely a key difference. And this starts getting into the larger point that I'm going to try to make with this video, is that these instruments, while seeming very similar on the surface, actually have very different purposes, because this is much more of a performance instrument than the Roland MC-101 is. Like, the Roland MC-101 definitely is a performance instrument, but not nearly as much as the Tracks is in terms of the way that it's designed. The Tracks has everything right in here to do an entire live set. And when you start connecting external synths, that becomes even more powerful, and I will get into that in a bit. But point being, if you are trying to make an entire song just on this and then only process the stereo mix in post, you're going to have your sidechain in here, you've got your effects and your distortions in here, and you can get a mix on this thing sounding incredibly polished, including mixing in external hardware synths, and once again, we'll get into that. Whereas with this, you can get something sounding pretty good, but in my opinion, it's going to be a lot better to record this into your DAW and then mix it in post. So the sidechain, it's not like a huge difference, but it's indicative of different design philosophies and different use cases, and I need to plug this in. That does bring me actually to another key difference, and that's the batteries. The MC-101 takes AA batteries. The Circuit Tracks has an internal battery that lasts for approximately 4 hours. And you can charge it via USB-C, which is super nice to have. And I'm sure you could power this off of like an Anker power bank or something like that. So that's definitely a change from the original circuit and a change from the MC-101. Some people will like this change because it means that you're not going through AA batteries like an insane person, but also that means that I'm probably going to just leave this plugged in all the time unless I'm using it. Like, I'm just going to have a set charging station for this thing in my room, whereas with this, you can just kind of grab and go, let it live in your backpack if you want, that kind of thing. That's definitely a little bit different. Probably won't be a deal breaker for most. You can use both of these just not plugged into anything at all other than a pair of headphones, but it is worth knowing in advance. The next key difference comes down to workflow. And I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but the workflow on this is definitely clunkier than the circuit workflow. This has gotten a lot better since I did my last video comparing the original circuit and the Roland MC-101. Several former updates have included some quality of life updates that add some shortcuts that make working on this thing significantly easier and more fluid than it used to be, but the Circuit Tracks still has a much better designed user interface in my opinion. The Roland MC-101 is going to have a lot more menu diving, which a lot of people are not a fan of, myself included. So for instance, if I want to change out my synth patch here, I have to go in here, go to preset, scroll until I find a thing, and then just tab through this. And that's fine. It's not a huge deal, but there's some menu diving involved. And that obviously goes further. You know, I showed you editing sounds. If you want to edit the sound, I would hit Shift Sound, go into Settings, and then I can tab through all the results. That gives you a decent amount of control, but it is not all that hands-on. You spend a lot of time staring at this little screen. A lot of people have made fun of Roland for their tiny screens. I actually don't have a problem with that. I think the less screen on devices like this, the better. However, that does introduce more menu diving than maybe you would want. Whereas on the circuit, let's say I want to change out the sound. Hit preset, select something different. Let's just say that. I've got that, and then I've got macros set up right here. You cannot design sounds from scratch with the devices alone. You have to connect them to a computer to do that, but both devices have ways to shape and customize the presets once you have them loaded. And in this case, you've just got a bunch of knobs with a bunch of parameters set, much more hands-on. I'd say you probably get a bit of deeper control with this, like you can change a sound from poly to mono or vice versa, for instance, and you've got a reliable control of things like filter cutoff, release, resonance, attack decay, all that kind of stuff. Whereas on here, these macros are kind of up to the patch designer, and of course you can customize those if you connect to a computer. Once again, this is more hands-on, this is maybe a bit more control, but this is probably easier to automate, including the ability to automate per step very easily, which is pretty cool. So for instance, if I've got this synth track here, let me just bring in a few more steps. And let me just pull up this one pattern. I can hold record, select a step. Let's just do a blatant change here with the filter. So then, that is super easy. That is not so easy on here. You can do some automation, but it is nowhere near as controlled or intuitive. Some people don't like that the Circuit Tracks doesn't contain a screen. I think that's a mistake. I think the fact that it doesn't have a screen means that the pads become the screen, and that's a really hands-on and intuitive way to work. These workflow differences also stem from the fact that this device is just so much smaller. For instance, if you're trying to program in notes, you go to sequence, you select the step, then you go to note and select the note, then you go back to sequence, and you do this little back and forth dance between these two pages. Whereas on here, as you saw me do, I could just hold a note, drop it into here. Watch. Right there. Or I can do the reverse. Super easy. Recording into here is pretty similar. I think this is a little easier for things in the recording to go wrong. It seems to get confused when doing quantization a little bit more than this does, but maybe that's just me. But regardless, doing things like programming and notes is much more straightforward and intuitive on the Circuit Tracks than it is on the 101, although the 101 did add some quality of life updates. For instance, if you go into sequence, you can hold down Shift in Project, remove steps like this, which is a lot easier, but still, it's not the most ideal. You can also do stuff like manually set what the step is in terms of a note, its velocity, its length, all that kind of stuff. Once again, not as intuitive on here, but really not too bad once you get used to it. And the design philosophy of immediacy doesn't just pertain to things like entering notes or doing automation. It also goes down to how these function as performance instruments. For instance, they both have the structures of clips or patterns, as they're called on the circuit, and then scenes as like larger collections of patterns. But the circuit takes that a step farther and lets you switch between projects. And that is incredibly powerful for doing a live set. I could not see myself doing an entire live set on the 101 unless I just end a song, switch to another project, and then start up again. Whereas on this, you could do an entire continuous mix of completely DAWlessly generated music, and that's something that this is not quite equipped to do. You can perform individual songs, but probably not a bunch of songs strung together. So I can show you what I mean by that. Let me pull up this project again to get rid of any of the changes. If I want to switch this drum clip out, for instance, I gotta go to clip, make sure the track is selected, and then select the next clip. This one's just empty to give you an idea. Same goes on these other tracks. You have to switch between tracks to select clips for each track. Whereas on the circuit, you go to patterns, boom. Patterns for synth 1, patterns for synth 2, MIDIs, drums, they're all just right there, immediately available. You can switch between a bunch all at once and let them all change with the beat and just go from there. That's super immediate. This can't quite do that, probably partially because it's just so small. And if you want to change a bunch of stuff at once, you hold down clip and then you can choose different scenes. And you preset these to have drastic changes in terms of which patterns are or are not selected and what the parameters of those patterns are. That's nice to have. This works very similarly, actually. This is new to the Circuit Tracks. If you go to Mixer, you can also set scenes, and they just live over here, and you can use a combination of switching between scenes and mutes and unmutes to create drastic changes in your arrangement. So on a pattern or clip level, this wins, in my opinion, because everything is just on one page, whereas with this, you have to switch back and forth. On a scenes level, I would say these are roughly equivalent, But for the Roland MC-101, that's where it ends. For the circuit tracks, you also have projects. And let me demonstrate this right now. You can switch between projects as if they're scenes. So notice I switched out one of the synth tracks for a different preset, and I switched up the drum pattern. You can make much more drastic changes than that. And if you just fill up all of your project slots in a somewhat logical way, you can even change the colors of these. You can build up an entire set with this and go seamlessly from song to song, or just have one song that goes through a ton of variations. This can't quite get there. So as a performance instrument, I would say the Circuit Tracks wins on that front. In terms of changing parameters on the fly, I would also say the Tracks wins, because you select a synth and then you've got the 8 macros to be able to change on the fly. Whereas with this, you can only change one parameter at a time for each track, and you have to switch between these different menus to really have control over that. Normally I leave it on filter, because filter movement is a huge part of creating an electronic song arrangement. I reach for the filter a lot on this too, but this has more control just right here, right in front of you. Great for performance. I should also note, both of these have master effects, although the filter on this is not really meant for live performance, I don't think. It can't like lock to anything. Like this has a little lock here to keep it at neutral. This is very much meant for performance. I think this is more meant for shaping the master effects that you send stuff to. You could probably perform with this, but I wouldn't. Another difference in performance, though, that this has that the Circuit doesn't is scatter effects. That is a bit much. However, you can edit a lot about these scatter effects. For instance, you can set it up so that the scatter effects only affect one of the tracks. You can only send it to one track or to all of them with absolutely no in between. And you can tweak the parameters of these scatter effects to make them a lot more useful. For instance, I like to slow this one down to make it more like a one-off tape stop effect. And I use that a lot when creating kind of more hip-hop style stuff. You know, you've got like an octave drop, sample and hold type thing, reverse, all that kind of stuff, which is something that's pretty unique to this. I used to think that it was a gimmick, but at this point, once I realized I could tweak these settings and could send it to just one track, it really opened up the possibilities of what this thing is capable of. That is something that this just doesn't have. Let's move on to sound quality, and this is going to be a huge one for a lot of people, and a lot of people are very opinionated about it, so I'm going to try to give a bunch of these opinions kind of a fair shake here. So a lot of people will say that the MC-101's sound engine, the Zen Core sound engine, sounds better than the Circuit's sound engine, which is the 10-year-old Nova synth engine. They're probably not wrong, to be honest. I think this is capable of some kind of dirtier sound, some more kind of stuff that's good for like electro house and dubstep, whereas this, at least in terms of the presets, kind of chokes on that, although I'm sure I could probably design some pretty good sounds if I really spent the time on it. But overall, Novation didn't really bother updating the synth engine much, and I think it's solid, but some people don't like how it sounds and much prefer the versatility and depth of the Zen Core sound engine. That's definitely fair. I'm not going to grudge them that. This thing can sound incredibly polished, and this thing can get close, but not quite there. So that's a super quick explanation of the differences in sound quality in terms of the internal synth engines on both of these devices, and I'm going to play some audio examples at the end. But these can both be expanded in different ways that really unlock their capabilities and start to really diverge in terms of their purposes. And it's actually why I'm totally happy that I own both. The MC-101 has audio over USB, which is already lovely to have, but even nicer is its ability to record all 4 separate tracks into your DAW over USB all at once. So what this means is that I can do a live jam on this, like record it for YouTube, and I make sure that I record this via USB into my computer, recording all 4 of these tracks separately. Note that you can't break up one drum track into multiple separate tracks. That's just all baked into this one track. So 4 tracks, record them separately, mix that in post, and so then you get the best of both worlds. You get the live performance element, great for a video, a fun hands-on way to arrange a song, and then you get to polish it in your DAW add sidechain, EQ, compression, effects, master it, a lot of fine control there. So it's a really great hybrid approach that I value a ton. I think it's really clever what Roland's done here, and if this was like my only song creation tool, I do quite well with that. I get the hands-on nature, even if it's not as smooth as this, and I get to polish it in my DAW and really fine-tune my mix. So that's lovely. As a standalone individual song creation tool, this is an incredible device. The Circuit takes a different approach, and a lot of people were bummed that it doesn't have audio over USB, and I was a little bummed too, but here's what it gains. It gains the ability with these two MIDI tracks to sequence two separate external synthesizers and then bring their audio back into the circuit to get processed by it. So if I have, like, say, my Arturia Microfreak and like a Korg Volca keys over here, these two tracks can control those, make them generate notes and melodies and all that kind of stuff. And then I get two more audio cables and feed the audio of both of those synths, mono, back into the circuit, and I can send those to the effects like reverb and delay and to the sidechain. So my external synths get really seamlessly integrated into the sound of this thing, and the Circuit Tracks basically just assimilates external stuff into itself and makes it like an extension of the circuit, which is incredible. What Novation has done here is honestly genius. That makes this much more of a studio in a box. Not only can it be the central brain of a setup, but it's also the mixer of a setup. It's the beginning and the end of a setup, if that makes sense. So if you've already got external synths and maybe you don't find you use them as much as you'd like, even though you love the way they sound, pairing them with this is incredibly powerful because you get the hands-on nature of this workflow and you get the versatility of being able to take any sound engine from any synth you want and make it a part of this device, which is, I think, one reason that Novation opted not to update the Nova engine. I should also mention you can record unquantized or quantized into both of these. I think this does a bit better with that, but if you have your swing turned up, it does tend to cause a few issues, so I would approach that carefully. You can do microsteps on both, so that's things like hi-hat ratchets. So let me just demonstrate that real quick. Let me just choose this one. Like that. And you can do that on a step-by-step basis. Same here. And you have a good amount of control over that as well. So let me just show you like this. Very similar deal on here. I should also note that you can set your scale on both of these devices. So if I go into notes here, right now this is on a chromatic scale. The chromatic scale will look very similar on here, but you can also change that to a bunch of different scales or modes and change the key of the song that you're in. That is pretty much the same on both devices. But to quickly move back into differences, a difference between this that this doesn't have is if you tap note a second time, you get a chord mode with one finger chords, which is pretty cool. This does not have that feature built in. This also, as of its most recent update when I'm filming this, got an arpeggiator. This has no arpeggiator, although to be completely honest, I basically never use the arpeggiator on this one and prefer to usually just come up with an ARP part on my own. If you do want stuff like a chord or an ARP mode with the circuit, connecting an Arturia Microfreak or similar synth to it kind of adds that because that has an arpeggiator and a chord oscillator built in. Of course, that solution requires buying a whole other piece of hardware, but it's not a big enough difference to where you're gonna hugely miss it on here, but it's nice to have on here. One other key difference that I do want to quickly mention as well, this added a few features like probability and mutate. I've messed around with Mutate a little bit. It basically just kind of rearranges a pattern, helps you come up with some new stuff. I've had varied results. It worked pretty well on here for this main melody. It's definitely hit or miss. This doesn't have anything like that built in. And it also has probability, and you heard that on that little kick roll. I have that set up with a very low probability. So for the most part, it just won't happen. And then every now and again, it'll go, oh, you know what? I should trigger that kick roll. And it'll do that little brrr. This doesn't have probability built in. Probability is really nice to have. That's new to the Circuit Tracks. Electron Stuff's had that for ages, and Circuit looked at that and said, I want some of that. It's fun to have, can create some nice variation, especially if you have a lot of percussion flying around. Not strictly necessary, but it is neat. So those are all the features and design philosophies that I wanted to talk through. Let's answer the question, who should get what? Because that's probably what you really came here for. I would say that the Circuit is great for beginners or people with larger setups. And then the MC-101 is for people looking to make fully polished songs, and they already have a bit of experience. And let me get a bit deeper into that. In my opinion, the Circuit Tracks still wins in terms of workflow. Using this thing is so smooth and so intuitive and very hands-on. So if you are a beginner, this will be much easier for you to sink your teeth into than this. This will probably be an uphill battle and kind of frustrating. You can absolutely learn this as a beginner, but you're going to have, I think, a more pleasant experience learning the Circuit Tracks. And also, you don't need to plug in external synths with this thing right away. Like, you can use it self-contained. I've made albums worth of music with just a circuit with just internal synth and drum tracks. And the overall premium feeling that the updated build gives you makes this an easy recommendation for me for beginners. However, if you've got a bit of experience in digital audio workstations or even with hardware, you should be able to get your head around this. Not too bad. It's a bit of a steeper learning curve, bit more memorization of shortcuts and such, but I did an entire video on that and other tricks and hacks to get more out of this thing. Because of the more polished synth engine, and especially because of the multi-track USB audio out, this is great for making really polished, like radio or Spotify playlist ready music. So if you're trying to make like fully polished electronic music, you know what you're doing, you're going to get a ton out of this. But if you want to work with a larger setup or do more live performance, once again, I think the Tracks becomes the better option because of its ability to sequence external synth and seamlessly bring them in, and because of its ability to have so much control over patterns, scenes, and projects, and build up an entire live set on this thing. You know, this is from the makers of the Launchpad. They get live performance. And so if you're trying to do DAW-less live performance, whether it's just on this device or sequencing external gear and bringing it in, I think you're going to have a much better experience on the Tracks. So it's kind of a continuum. On one end are the beginners, and I think it's a bit of a toss-up, but the Tracks barely wins. In the middle is the mildly intermediate to expert producer looking to make fully polished Spotify playlist ready songs. I'm going to give that edge to the MC-101. And then going further down the advanced line, there's the person looking to do DAW-less live performance or work with a table full of gear really intuitively and seamlessly. I'm going to give that one to the Tracks. Obviously, this is all subject to change based on how these devices get updated, and I will do a full video comparing this to the Circuit Rhythm once that comes out, and I think that might be a very different video. That is where I'm going to leave the talking portion of this video, so here are a few sound demos, and thank you so much for watching. And that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see some more related videos, you can click or tap up over here. Highly recommend you give those a watch, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.